Hello and welcome back to the Hero Report. My name is Ari Cohen. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And with me, as always, is Matt Langdon of the Hero Construction Company. How are you, Matt?
I'm doing well. I've got some internet working and ready to go.
Good. Glad to hear it. We had some technical difficulties with our first recording of this episode of the Hero Report, but I think we're ready to go. It seems like we have a good connection this time, so we'll see what we can get up to today. Last time it was snowing. Today it's really sunny out, so I think things are looking up for us. I'm excited because today we're going to talk about superheroes. So this is the first superhero report. If it goes well, I think we'll probably do a few more of these because obviously it's a topic that a lot of people care about. Maybe they even care about it more than an academic presentation of heroism. I don't know. It's debatable. But I have to say, when we came up with this idea, part of me was very excited, and part of me was a little bit nervous because I have to, in the interest of full disclosure, I have to tell you, I actually don't read comic books. I've never read comic books. I think the closest that I have come in the past to comic books is reading Michael Chabon's novel, The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which is really not close at all, I think. So part of the discussion that I think we'll have today is maybe why comic books have never really appealed to me. But Matt, are you a comic book reader?
I am a comic book reader, not as much as I used to be, but but I'm not reading a lot of superhero comics, so I'm not sure that I can bring a lot of recent comic book news to the table. But I did, in my day, read some superhero comics. I used to read the Justice League for a little while, and read a lot of X-Men because my brother was collecting them during the early 90s, I suppose. So they were appealing to me, and part of it was they were based in Australia at the time, so that was appealing as well to see how ridiculously some foreign authors could visualize Australia. But yeah, it's interesting because it is the two things are separate. I think they may have started together, superheroes and comics, but now they're not mutually tied together. Superheroes have almost taken over our box offices more than our comics. So I've seen a lot of the superhero movies and had different reactions to different versions. And I know that's where you come in, where your interest is from movies.
Yeah, the truth is, despite never reading comic books, I'm really interested in comic book characters. I've always watched comic book characters in the cartoons ever since I was a little kid. And as you say, I'm really interested in the comic books that have become films. Which, I mean, we all know they're incredibly successful, and I've watched a ton of them in preparation for this particular podcast. My wife can tell you she is now well-versed in X-Men lore. In fact, the most recent thing that we just watched was Captain America, which I have to say was, I thought, just dreadful. But we can talk about that in a minute. The comic book movies have really grasped my imagination. I've wanted to see pretty much all of them, which is strange, right? I presume that I'm not really their audience as someone who doesn't care at all about how they compare with the comic book legacy, as someone who doesn't really know that universe. Or maybe I am, because I'm less likely to complain when they get something wrong. Who knows? I guess there's an open question for all the filmmakers out there who are listening to this podcast. But I really do think that as we decided to talk about superheroes today, I was thinking about, as I was styling my hair as much like Wolverine as I could, I was really thinking about the ways in which I'm not interested in superheroes, despite my interest in heroism.
So you're saying you're not interested in superheroes?
I don't think I am.
But you like watching the movies?
I like watching the movies, but my favorite movies are the ones that aren't really about superheroes. Right? I think those are the best movies. That I was sitting. Yeah, okay, I will. In particular, I was thinking about the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, which I think are the. I think people would be hard pressed to argue that there are other movies, comic book movies, that are better. I think those are the best. At least the first two that we've seen. Those aren't superhero movies, though. As I understand it, Batman is not a superhero. Batman is just he's a regular dude. And in fact, the Christopher Nolan scripts, and maybe this is true of the comics as well, on which they're based, there aren't even super villains. Nobody's super.
Right. So I think they're comic book movies as opposed to superhero movies, right?
And there you go. And so that's a big difference for me. They're comic book characters, but they're not superheroes. The things I'm least interested in are the really super duper heroes. Like, I mean, the most super of them all, Superman. I think Superman is terrible. I have no interest in Superman. And the reason I have no interest in Superman is the super part.
I have that argument over and over again that it's very, and I think what you're aiming towards here is that it's hard to be heroic when you're super duper, right? And I've had that argument with two friends in particular who idolize Superman. I think it came from wearing their pajamas when they were kids. But they think he's fantastic. But that's the reality, is there's very little risk involved in Superman's day-to-day life. And in fact, there's an argument that Superman is not at all heroic, because his powers, depending on who's depicting them, enable him to travel around the world at the speed of sound, and he could be fixing things constantly, but he doesn't. He spends a lot of time just super-dupering around and getting into small issues or going on dates, and so the argument could be, here is this man who could be constantly helping others, but he chooses not to. So it's when you create a character that has such unbridled power, you're creating someone who it's very hard to be interested in or have empathy with. And that for me, that goes, and I think you said you've seen all these pre-Avenger movies, but that always for me was a problem with Thor. I had no interest in reading the comics of Thor. However, I think that they tried to tackle that problem in the movie because they really did introduce us to the gods. And so Thor, in relation to gods, is quite powerful, but not necessarily the most powerful. So they did show him struggling, which I think was a smart move. A lot of people were upset about that because we couldn't relate to gods. But if you just put Thor in the middle of Earth, he's another Superman with little interest, little conflict.
Yeah, I think that's really key. It puts me in the mind of really Achilles again, right? I can't get away from talking about Achilles, which I suppose is a good thing. I've been writing that book for years, so it should be on my mind. But Achilles makes sense when you stick him in relation to the gods and men. Right? That's why the movie Troy is such a failure, right? Because there's no gods. So Achilles is as godlike as one can be. But when you look at the Iliad, and Achilles is part of this broader universe, he can't do some things. He's mortal, and that's a critical component. That's how we can identify with him in some sense, even though he is better than us, superior to us, he still has these challenges. He can't compete with the gods, even the lesser gods, like the river god. But Superman, I mean, he's not from this planet, right? There's nothing about him really that's like us. And I remember even when I was little watching, was it the Justice League, which was Superman and his friends, essentially? Yep. Batman, Aquaman, Wonder Woman. I'm sure I'm missing somebody. Sorry to whomever I'm missing. But I remember thinking when I was like 7 years old, all of those other characters are extraneous. They have no purpose here. Because if you're Superman, why do you need Batman's help? What's Batman going to do for you? I mean, you can fly around the world backward and stop time. Batman's going to jump in his car and go drive somewhere and do something helpful? Or Aquaman, in case you need to go underwater and talk to people? I thought that was it was preposterous. And that's the problem with Superman. Because he can effectively be everywhere. He can effectively do everything. And he's, at least as I understand it, he's incorruptible. What are the challenges that he faces? The only challenge is this made-up foil, right? That is a piece of his planet, right, that somehow interacts negatively with his superness. And so that's the only, and so everybody in every episode of the Superman story, there has to be enough of that going around that he can always be presented with it so that he has to overcome it. It's the same a ridiculous challenge that he faces every time. And it's a challenge that's external to people as well, right? These bad people simply got their hands on the kryptonite, which enables them to slow Superman down. Harm him in some way, at least temporarily, while they go on with their nefarious plans. But then, of course, he overcomes it. He overcomes it every time. It's never in doubt. And that is that's the definition, I think, of something that bores me, right? When we're talking about heroism, because if you know that you're going to succeed, and we know that the character is going to succeed in every endeavor, well, then what's the point? Why watch? Why read? And I guess that's why the Superman comics get more and more, I guess they get darker, right? Doesn't Superman die at some point? And, spoiler alert from, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? But they have to do these things to keep people coming back. After 70 years of this guy prevailing in every single situation, it's exhausting for the reader. So you have to do something really shocking.
Right. He had a role in World War II propaganda and Cold War propaganda of the unstoppable patriot, but modern audiences just don't, there's nothing there for them. So yeah, you kill him off with a made-up character and you replace him with 4 different versions of Superman, and yeah, it just gets ridiculous. And I think ultimately every superhero story that's effective is a hero's journey, and I think that's where a lot of movies these days are getting bogged down with that. They're forgetting that. I saw a great YouTube video on fixing Star Wars Episode 1 a couple of days ago, and he was right, because what the movie needed was a main character who went through a hero's journey. But I think that became prevalent in the 90s, especially started in the 90s, of having this anti-hero, or someone who was cool because of weapons or because of his anger or whatever it might be, and they forgot that they also needed a compelling story, and obviously the risk that comes with that hero's journey.
Yeah, and that's the key, right? Part of what makes it compelling is the idea that, and this really dovetails with what we talked about the last time we met up, just the two of us, right? Part of what makes this so compelling is the potential for failure. It's the risk. It's the idea that you might not succeed. And so if it's always a foregone conclusion because of a superness, that these are people who will succeed, well, then you have a real problem. And maybe, actually, Matt, maybe that's why I like the X-Men, even though I shouldn't, right? By my own accounting, they're really super, and so I shouldn't like them. But the challenge there is that they actually have foils who are also super. And so there is a real test every time, right? Because it's not like it's the X-Men against the two of us. Yeah, as super as we might be. It's the X-Men against other mutants who have interesting powers themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the key for a believable superhero is that they can theoretically die. And when you start messing with their ability to die or their ability to be hurt, that's when they lose, or we lose empathy with them. And that's certainly the Superman problem. But I think X-Men almost usually has characters that are mortal. You shoot them and they'll die. And now that doesn't happen very often, and they often have lots of ways that they can avoid being shot. But I think Wolverine approaches that Superman problem because he is virtually indestructible as well. Now he's got a backstory and he's got drama and that sort of thing that help us care about him. But I think it's easy to go the wrong way with him, and I think that's what happened in the individual Wolverine movie as opposed to the X-Men movies. They did treat him like a person in the X-Men movies, and the Wolverine movie itself was very, here's a bad guy who's mostly, good most of the time, but don't get on his bad side, and he didn't really do anything to help anyone. It was all self-motivated, except for about 5 minutes where he released some people from a prison. But apart from that, it was vengeance and it was self-serving. So I was really excited when they announced that Darren Aronofsky was going to be doing the second Wolverine movie, but he's since pulled out. And there's obviously something holding back that second movie. And is it script or is it feedback from the last one? Who knows? But I think Wolverine approaches that problem of being a character who is virtually impossible to kill.
Yeah, and the reason, and the funny thing, of course, is that Wolverine is, I would guess, but we could look at numbers, but he's probably the most popular of the X-Men, right? I mean,
absolutely.
People think he's fascinating, and I think that there's a variety of reasons for that. The first, I think the most common reason is because he's tough as nails, and he's got the adamantium spikes that shoot out of his hands, and then maybe it's that he has kind of a bad attitude. I think people think that that's fun, but I think that one of the things that worked, as you said, in the X-Men films was the fragileness or the brokenness of the Logan character, right? That, I think, allowed him to really come across to audiences and for audiences to care about him because he was shown caring about other characters, right? Anna Paquin's character, Rogue, do I have that right? Yeah. And I think that that interaction really mattered. It also really mattered that in the first X-Men movie, for all anybody knew, they left everything about his backstory entirely unclear and unresolved. And even though everybody knows about the secret project and so on and so forth, his character doesn't. And I think that really spoke to the brokenness of the character we were watching. It explained his attitude. It gave us a real human being, even though we saw him as this virtually indestructible Wolverine. I think that was a perfect way of doing it. That I think, as you say, the X-Men Origins movie really failed because it showed us everything about this character that presumably purported to resolve all of the tensions and all of the issues, and just made him a human wrecking ball. And who cares about that ultimately? Because you can watch any number of movies where people fight and destroy things. You can play any number of video games where the whole terrain explodes. At some point, what we're looking for is a story. We're looking for how this person came to be, and to fail at that origin story, that really interesting origin story, I think was a huge, huge problem. And I think a lot of people who were really excited about Wolverine and about him getting a franchise of his own, I think were deeply, deeply let down. And that perhaps is why we're not seeing a second one. and why maybe we won't. I don't know, but maybe we won't at all.
Yeah, and I think what happens here is there's a thin line between a superhero and a supervillain, and authors have been really flirting with that line for a long time, and so you get these characters that are kind of assholes, really. And Wolverine in the first two X-Men movies was not that. He was prickly. He was frustrated with life. He was an outsider. But as you say, he was shown to be caring. And I'm fascinated by this problem that Hollywood has with creating female superhero movies. And there's this prevailing wisdom that you just can't make a successful superhero movie with a woman in charge. And what I find amusing about that is that they don't seem to have realized that the superhero movies that they've made are actually about villains. So when they made Catwoman as an independent franchise, she's a villain, and sometimes teams up with Batman, and I'm sure we're going to see that in this third Nolan movie, that there's an uneasy relationship there, but at base she's a criminal. The same with Elektra. Elektra was an assassin. These characters are supposed to be foils for the hero. You can't make a rewarding movie about a villain. You need the hero's journey. And so I don't necessarily think Wonder Woman is the best example, because there's pressures from her 50s origins and 70s TV show of ridiculous costumes and things like that. Could they make a great story? Absolutely, as long as they don't feel like they have to have her running around in high-heel boots and whatnot. But they need someone who represents the hero, who goes on a journey, who comes from somewhere and goes somewhere. And they just haven't tried that. And I think it's absolutely doable, but they feel like there's this curse that it's just not doable, that audiences aren't interested. And I think if you look at the success of Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Veronica Mars, there's absolutely room for positive female heroes that are actually heroic.
Well, who's a character that you would float for them to try?
Well, there aren't a lot of them.
Yeah.
But Black Canary was a hero sometimes with the Justice League. She's very, very much doable. There's various Batman hangers-on, but I don't even necessarily think they need to pull it from the comics. Hollywood is capable of creating a story, a superhero story from scratch. Well, theoretically capable.
Maybe.
But certainly part of the problem is there haven't been a lot of great female superheroes in the comic world. But why not Black Canary? I think she's a crime fighter. I think if you presented her story in a realistic way, where she's struggling and deciding on heroism, I think that's absolutely doable.
Yeah, I do think, you talk about the hero's journey, and we talked about this last week with Drew Jacob, the importance of this sort of quest, or, in the movies it's always regarded as kind of backstory, where these heroes come from, what drives them, what motivates them, so that when they go do whatever it is that they're doing, we have some frame for it. Sometimes they try to do too much of that. Right, I was thinking. I started out talking about Captain America, which I just watched with a little kid. I don't spend enough time in theaters these days, perhaps. But the movies come to me; they're just a little delayed. And with Captain America, it could have been even more delayed, as far as I was concerned. That was a long movie where the resolution was never in doubt, and where the amount of backstory and origin and hero's journey business was so excessive that you felt like the author, whoever wrote the script, they knew that they had to have origin story, and so they just laid it on in such a heavy-handed and thick way that, they could have dispensed with a half an hour of it. All of this, here's the puny guy who just wants to fight in the war, but he's too small, and he keeps getting rejected, and his strapping friend is off to war, and so on. And the scientists, and it went on. It must have been an hour.
It was unbalanced, for sure.
It was unbearable.
That too. I think they missed the point there. I think if you look at some of the classic hero's journey movies like Star Wars, it's just clearly demonstrated where this hero starts the story. It's not hard to illustrate the kind of life that the hero's leading, because that's the kind of life that most of us are leading. And then you bring the call to adventure in early, and you can definitely spend some time on that call to adventure, on the refusal of the call, or that sort of thing. But yeah, spending all of that time, I gave them credit because they wanted to make sure that we understood what was heroic, that it wasn't just having superpowers and having a shield and running in to kill Nazis. But it was long, it was heavy-handed, and it was obvious. I mean, it was never really, you were never really surprised that this puny guy was going to get noticed by the powers that be.
Well, that's, 4 different characters say to the hero, we're going to choose you because you have this internal quality, not the external qualities, right? Everyone is looking for speed and strength, but you're a nice person. They actually said those words multiple times, right? So it's as though they think that the audience couldn't understand it unless it was written down. That was stunning to me, and made even more stunning by the fact that the heroism actually had very little to do with all of this, he's a good person, and so on, right?
I was just going to say he was successful because he was big and fast and had an indestructible shield.
Right. The best part of the film is the conclusion. Well, the penultimate chapter of the film, not the conclusion. But the penultimate chapter, again, spoiler alert, but this movie's been out a long time, he makes the right decision, which is to sacrifice himself and save the city or whatever. And presumably that part has nothing to do with his speed and his strength and his excellent shield, right? That is all the person within, right? And I think that's the best part of the film, but we didn't need all of the people telling him what a good person he is at the beginning in order for that payoff. Because I think that if you ask most people who saw that movie, the heroism was the blowing people up and killing all the Nazis, right? Defeating the bad guy and so on. But that wasn't actually, to my mind, the heroism. The heroism was when the puny guy inside really comes out, right? By making that appropriate decision, the self-sacrifice to save millions. I think that was the heroic denouement, but it wasn't sold that way to the audience because the central hour of the film was all about weapons and explosions, and that's what people want to see, I guess, right? Weapons and explosions, so here's a lot of them. And now self-sacrifice, which ultimately, of course, because it's a superhero movie, doesn't turn out to be that big of a sacrifice because, again, spoiler alert, he's not dead.
Right. Yeah, and I think, I think everybody knows that there's a pressure on Hollywood when they're making a $100 million plus movie to have explosions in it. And, I think that happened in the first Nolan Batman too, to a certain extent. I think he bowed to the pressures, and at that point he wasn't a bankable director. He'd made a couple of critically acclaimed movies, but the end of that movie I just felt was completely trite and formulaic.
Yeah, the whole set blows up.
Yeah, and so the second movie, he was trusted, and he knew that, hey, the first one did really well. There's a lot of anticipation for this one. I'm going to make it a proper story. Now, hopefully, the third one follows suit. I I find that as movies go along further and further, the temptation is to just keep adding characters without subtracting characters. Happens with TV series all the time. So hopefully he's able to manage that and create a story that's worth doing. So yeah, I mean, I think there's pressures. I'm curious on what you thought about Thor, because I generally enjoyed the movie. I felt that what was missing was a genuine love story, but apart from that, I feel like there was a struggle for him personally.
It is the character that perhaps I understand the least, all right? And so, I think that everybody universally around the country or whatever thought that it was the worst of the movies, right? I might be wrong. For me, Captain America was the worst because it didn't do anything. So it was improved on that, but it was still no original Iron Man. The original Iron Man, I thought, was really clever and really interesting, and everything that's come thereafter has been pale imitation of that. The second Iron Man, I thought, was a catastrophe. Just an utter catastrophe. That was someone saying, boy, that first one sure made a lot of money. What if we blow up a lot more stuff and just do the same thing again? And lo and behold, that made a ton of money. They were right. If people are tasked with making money, they know what the formula is, as you say. Blow up a bunch of stuff as part of a successful franchise. But I think that's the problem with all of these movies, ultimately. And maybe it's a problem with the comic books, too. You can tell me this, or our listeners can write in and tell me this. I feel like you start with a good idea. Here's an interesting idea, and we'll spin it out for a little while so we get to know who these people are, what makes them tick, and we'll give them challenges that they have to overcome. But after a while, you run out of things to do. You hit a wall, and then things either become absurd or you just do more of the same stuff again. And I think the comics have it much harder ultimately than the movies, because the movies, you do 2 or 3 of them. It's 5 or 6 hours of your time, and then you're done. You put enough explosions in there, no one's really going to pay attention to a weak story. But with the comics, there's decades of these things, and they're coming out pretty rapidly. And ultimately, I'm sure that if you flip back through the collected history of Spider-Man, the same junk just keeps happening, right? It's over and over again. And now we're seeing that in the film too, right? They're just going to reboot Spider-Man and tell us the same story again, as far as I can tell, with different actors.
It's an impressive move that they can do that, and that they are going to be doing that. But I think that happens with all media. I think they run out of stories. TV shows, I think, just go on way too long generally. I like the English approach to that, is to make 6-episode seasons. But as soon as you start going for a long time and producing a lot of content, you do run out of ideas. I think some of the iconic characters get rethought a lot of the time, and that's where that you can see that in the movies too. The current Batman versus the last sort of set of Batman movies, they have a very different feel, and so you can do that, and you can sort of relaunch and retell some stories. But yeah, a huge problem that the comics have is that they need to keep telling stories, but they also know that they've got people that have been reading the stories for 30 years who are going to be really annoyed if they change anything. So you have to kind of, comics are famous for retroactively changing histories, but generally that's a tough ask to do. And so you're telling stories about characters that were created in a completely different era, with different origins, and they regularly try to launch new characters, but it doesn't succeed very often. So what happens is you end up having these core X-Men, and then you try to sneak a new X-Men in and see if they take, and occasionally they do, and and time always helps with that. But yeah, it's retelling stories, and I think Spider-Man, it's going to be interesting because I use the first Spider-Man movie in my presentations, but I think about that and think, man, that came out a long time ago. It must have been 10 years ago. And so that when I'm talking to 12-year-old kids, I don't know that, they've definitely seen it, but this one is going to be their Spider-Man because they haven't seen, generally, they haven't seen that Spider-Man story before. Although with our modern TV options and DVD and Netflix, it's a lot easier for them to access previous versions of characters. But certainly this is going to be their Spider-Man.
Yeah, like Michael Keaton is our Batman.
Right.
for good or ill. Or maybe Val Kilmer, or was George Clooney a Batman
George Clooney
too?
was a Batman. Yeah.
Man, that series had a weird run.
It became a hot mess by the last one.
Oh my lord! They just kept adding villains and sidekicks. Right. By the end,
exactly,
you had Robin and Batgirl and 6 villains.
That was
they were
Joel
fighting
Schumacher,
against.
I think, did the last movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and
God, what a catastrophe!
Yep.
Is that one of the universally regarded as like one of the worst films?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Good. Good. Then I feel like I've got my finger on the pulse. Are there? You mentioned this a second ago, and I'm really curious about this. Maybe you don't know. I don't know myself. Are there new superheroes? Like, are people writing new superhero books?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And like I said, generally they get introduced in other series. But yeah, they're always trying to write new characters because especially these days, because if you write a compelling comic, it gets picked up by Hollywood pretty quickly. So that definitely happens. But they also, every decade or so, restart the whole universe essentially, and different things happen and different events have changed, that sort of thing. But yeah, they're always trying new characters because a new character can mean a new income stream, a new franchise, so to speak.
Right. So, what's an example of a new character or relatively new character? Can you think of one?
Well, I have not got my finger on the pulse. But there are a lot of comics coming out that are just not superhero, and that's generally what I read. But a big one that I remember when I was reading, because I read Spider-Man for quite a while, was Venom coming out of that, and he wasn't a hero, but he just sort of made an appearance, and all of a sudden I was like, oh my god, this is the coolest guy ever.
Right, and he got action figures and all. I remember that whole thing.
Yeah, but the same thing. There's independent creators all the time, and in the 90s, there was a real focus on the creators, the artists especially. And a number of them broke away from the big publishers and created their own imprint. Image was the big one at the time, and they were all new characters, all brand new. Because ultimately, it's not that hard to come up with a new character. You have kind of the concept of what their background is, what happened to give them the powers, what they look like, and then what their intentions are, and off you go. They go and battle people. So
I'm trying to think of these movies that I've seen. I'm sure they're all comic books, right? But I think it'd be a fun thing to do for a minute here. Let's rank these, right? What are the best and what are the worst? Which ones worked and which ones really failed? Right? Because the first one that came to mind as a real failure, after we just talked about the last of the old Batman series. Do you remember Daredevil?
Yep.
I mean, that was a real failure. That one, that was the blind superhero, as I recall.
Right.
Yeah, Ben Affleck, maybe?
Right, that's the big problem. You put Ben Affleck in anything, it's going to be terrible.
Yeah, that didn't go at all well. And did Elektra spin off from that? Yep.
So Elektra's a long-term enemy of Daredevil and lover. And there are some great comics from the late 80s around Daredevil and Elektra. Same with Batman. That time was really a big time for bringing dark characters together, or bringing dark characters into the fore. That was bad. The third Spider-Man was really bad. The third X-Men was really bad. Yeah. Again, because I think they just tried to bring too many characters. X-Men especially.
Well, there were like 17 or 18 people you had to keep track of by that point, right?
And for real X-Men fans, that was a real. It was a disaster because was it Brett Ratner? Was that the director? He decided to just kill a bunch of people, a bunch of characters that loved for a decade, and he's just like, here they are, bam, they're dead. Which is just such an irresponsible thing to do. The new X-Men I thought was pretty good.
Yeah, I liked it.
Conflict. I found the girl that played Mystique. Was terrible, and she's the girl in the Hunger Games coming out this year, which is a bit of a worry. But good ones for me were the first two Spider-Mans, the first two X-Men. They weren't just average. I thought they were all quite good. The second Spider-Man I thought really dealt with heroism very, very well. Mm-hmm. Obviously, wait.
Was that the Alfred Molina Spider-Man?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. What else? Watchmen. Did you see The Watchmen?
I did, and you know what? We should save The Watchmen and Batman for a whole new. I think that's a whole different episode, right? We really have to talk about the darkness and the vigilantism. I think that is really the other side of the comic book hero. So yes, I think those movies were really fascinating. That includes the Christopher Nolan Batman films, the Watchmen. And I'm sure there are some others that'll come up when we get to it. But yeah, those were good movies. I'm trying to think of other movies that come to. What about Hellboy? Did you see Hellboy?
I liked Hellboy a lot. Yep.
And what about Hellboy 2?
I liked that one too. I seem to recall. Yeah, I liked both of them. Again, I thought the actress was average in that.
Anytime there's a 2 or a 3, I feel like we're treading dangerous ground, because again, I think this really comes back to the idea that you're going to use your best material in that first film. You really want to sell the audience. You want to get them involved. You want to tell a compelling story. You want to figure out who the hero is and why, and those are the things that I think are the most interesting to us, right? Who the hero is and why the hero is going about his or her business. I think that is the critical thing. So then what do you do in the second one or the third one except bring in more or do it again?
Well, I think we've sort of touched on this as well, is the first movie being successful is not necessarily about being a good story. It's about getting bums on seats, which is sometimes blowing things up. And so the second Spider-Man movie, the second Batman movie, they really upped the ante because they really focused on story. I think the second Star Wars movie as well, that they were successful and they're like, wow, where are we going to take this? We can do whatever we want now. And having that license to do whatever you want can go one of two ways. You can really tell a great story, or you can just say, oh, let's just blow more stuff up to get more money. Which is Transformers, I think.
Do you think it matters with the Batman movie? I'm thinking in particular. They told all of that origin story early, the beginning of the first film, and so you don't have any of that really in the Joker second film, right? So what they did really, I think, is they concentrated a lot on the Joker. And they concentrated on sort of the challenge of being Batman.
Right, the theme of, the walking that line between doing good and doing bad. Yeah, absolutely.
And they were freed up. I mean, Nolan was freed up to do that because the origin story was out of the way.
Yep.
Do you think you could have a superhero movie where the origin story is completely out of the way?
I think you could. I think you'd have to you'd have to be very clever about how you reference how they got the powers. Well, not even that. I don't even think that the audience needs to know how they got their powers. They just need to know how they work. They need to be on the same page. That they're not going to be surprised by something that that was common knowledge to the hero. Absolutely, you can jump into a story because superhero stories are so common now. They're well known. The genre is understood. It's understood that the powers came from somewhere. But yeah, no, I absolutely think you can. Did you see the movie? It might not be on DVD yet, so you might not have seen it. Chronicle.
No.
Okay, so it's one of those sort of reality show versions where it's all told through a video camera that's in the story, and it's about 3 high school kids who get superpowers, and the origin story really is very minimal. Something falls out of the sky, they go and look at it, and then all of a sudden they've got powers. So it's more about what they do with the powers and how the powers change them. So I think the fact that that movie exists, I think means that yes, now we can have a superhero movie without that origin. Whereas before, it wasn't necessarily possible. But if you look at the X-Men, the first X-Men movie, that they weren't really. I mean, they showed how Magneto got his
or first used his power.
First showed him, right? Using his power.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's no origin to any of those people,
right?
Because it's a mutation, right? How do you show someone getting a mutation? You don't, right? If it's a genetic mutation and not the result of a spider bite, for example, then there's nothing to show except where you drop these people in at a moment in time and you say, here's what they're doing, or here's how they're dealing or not dealing with the pressures that come from being different in some way, which is why the first X-Men movie I thought was so successful. They didn't have to spend time on that stuff, but they did get back around to it, right? And I think in part that's why the second one works. In part that's why the Wolverine standalone didn't work. It's about how you get back around to it, because ultimately the audience does want that journey. We do want to know where you came from, not just what you're doing now. Right. It's like if you had, you wouldn't have a successful Star Wars franchise if you began with Luke and Han Solo rescuing Princess Leia. That's not a compelling way to start.
Absolutely. Right. I wonder, I'm not sure that you're going to be able to do this, but you do live in a university town, so I would highly recommend trying to find the comic Miracle Man.
Okay.
It's quite old, and it was written by 2 of the most legendary authors in the comic world at the moment. But it was a story about a man with Superman-type powers and what he actually does with them. So it's kind of put in real-world terms, and he does some very interesting things with that power, and it's a story on how power corrupts and things like that. So you might be able to find them in some old, dark, dingy comic store or something.
I'll send one of my research assistants on a mission to go find it. Right? I think that's the way that you set that up when you said you do live in a university town. Made me think. I don't know, and don't tell me, but it made me think that this guy decides that the way to be a superhero is to be a college professor, because of course there's a great history of that. People who have powers then go and teach. I think that's really, isn't that why I find the X-Men so compelling? Because he is, of course, a professor, that Charles Xavier, and with my my love of the Academy, it's nice to see a guy with superpowers, just open up a school.
Right.
Well, Matt, I have to say, I think this has been a really fun first cut, certainly maybe less comic book than people expected, and that's my fault. As I said from the beginning, I, for whatever reason, have never gotten into superhero or any other kind of comic books, but I do, as I say, I love the film versions. I watch them all. I spend a lot of time, as you can clearly see, thinking about why they work or why they fail. Now I have my mission. I'm going to go try to seek out Miracle Man, the comic, and read a comic book. And maybe by next time, or depending on how hard it is to locate further on down the road, we can get back into comic book discussions. And certainly I think it'll be fun, you and I, to talk about the vigilantes. I also could imagine a really interesting conversation about the villains. So we'll see where that goes down the road. But I should say this was a lot of fun. Thanks for talking about superheroes with me.
Not a problem. And as we haven't got a guest, I'm going to plug myself today. I'm doing a Kickstarter campaign to get funds raised for my hero deck, which is a deck of hero cards. There are some superheroes included, so it's slightly linked to today's conversation. But if you go to Kickstarter.com and search for Hero Deck or the Hero Deck, you can see what it's all about there. Any support would be very welcomed. I think it's going until March the 18th or 19th, somewhere around there. So that's my plug of the week. And next week, I think we're going to have Chad Ellsworth, who is teaching heroism to college students, especially in the Greek community, fraternities and sororities. So be very interested to see what he's got to say. He did his first program this past weekend, so we can see how that went and how it was received.
Yes. Well, Matt, thank you again. And everyone should go check out your Kickstarter project. The Hero Deck was actually something that I think we talked about at one point on one of these podcasts. But I think it's a great teaching tool, and there's all sorts of information up on Kickstarter. It's a project, in fact, that I have donated to, so I believe in it. Matt, we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.